The envelope reached Alexander Hayes 10 minutes before he was expected to welcome 500 guests into his Chicago penthouse, and the handwriting across the front belonged to a woman who had been missing from his life for 15 years. His assistant had found it beneath a stack of scholarship applications delivered that afternoon, without a return address, postage mark, or explanation for how it entered a building protected by private security. Alexander stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking Lake Michigan, turning the envelope between his fingers while the string quartet rehearsed beyond the closed library doors. He had seen that handwriting only once since college, on the farewell note Jasmine Carter left behind the night before he intended to propose. That note had contained 6 sentences, no reason for leaving, and one request he had never obeyed in his heart, even after he stopped searching for her. This new envelope contained only a single card, and the message inside created a question powerful enough to silence every memory he had spent years learning to live around. Before you announce the foundation expansion tonight, ask your grandmother what she did with my real letter. Alexander read the line 3 times before the library doors opened, and Margaret Hayes entered without knocking, dressed in silver silk and wearing the composed expression that had carried their family through funerals, lawsuits, and financial crises. She noticed the card in his hand, and for one unguarded second, fear crossed her face so clearly that Alexander understood the message was not a cruel imitation or an old friend's mistake. Margaret recovered quickly, reminding him that governors, hospital directors, investors, and scholarship families were already arriving downstairs, yet her voice lacked its usual authority. Alexander asked whether she had ever received a letter from Jasmine, and Margaret did not answer directly, which frightened him more than any confession might have. She told him there were conversations from the past that should not be reopened in the middle of a public celebration, especially on an evening when Hayes Capital planned to donate $20 million toward youth education. Alexander folded the card and placed it inside his jacket, then quietly said that silence had already controlled 15 years of his life, and he would not allow it to control another hour. Margaret looked toward the ballroom, where applause greeted the arrival of another prominent family, before asking him to wait until the guests departed. The charity celebration had been designed to announce the largest educational initiative in the history of Hayes Capital. Yet Alexander entered the ballroom with the uneasy awareness that someone in the room knew more about his own life than he did. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble. White roses lined the staircase, and waiters moved through conversations about medical research, political campaigns, and charitable endowments that could change entire neighborhoods. Daniel Brooks, Alexander's closest friend and longtime attorney, immediately noticed that something was wrong, although Alexander refused to explain while the room remained crowded. Margaret stayed near the stage, greeting donors with flawless elegance, but she repeatedly glanced toward the entrance, as though expecting a witness she had hoped never to face. Alexander followed her gaze, and when the elevator doors opened, every carefully prepared sentence disappeared from his mind. Jasmine Carter stepped into the ballroom, wearing a simple midnight blue dress, without jewelry, an entourage, or any visible desire to impress the wealthy strangers surrounding her. She looked older than the woman preserved in Alexander's memories, not diminished by time, but strengthened by whatever she had survived without him. Her hair rested naturally against her shoulders, and her expression carried the quiet steadiness of someone who had entered the room for a purpose more important than nostalgia. Instead of searching for Alexander, she crossed toward the scholarship volunteers, greeting several of them by name and asking whether the students' families had been seated near the stage. Sophia Ellis, the foundation's community outreach director, embraced her warmly, revealing a familiarity that left Alexander both relieved and unsettled. Jasmine had apparently worked alongside the foundation for years through partner organizations, contributing programs, recommending students, and refusing every opportunity for public recognition. She had remained close enough to influence Alexander's charitable work while staying distant enough to avoid him, and no one had understood the significance because she often used her married mother's surname, Carter Wells, in professional settings. Alexander felt 15 years collapse into a question he could no longer postpone. He crossed the ballroom slowly while conversations softened around him, and Jasmine turned before he reached her, as though she had always known precisely where he was standing. For several seconds, neither of them spoke, because an embrace would have pretended nothing had happened, while anger would have ignored everything they had once meant to each other. Alexander finally said her name, and the sound emerged less steadily than he intended. Jasmine studied his face with an expression that held tenderness, regret, and something close to disappointment, then told him she had wondered whether success would make him forget the promises they wrote together in college. He answered that success had never been the part of his life he struggled to remember, and her eyes briefly softened. Before either could say more, the master of ceremonies announced that Alexander's speech would begin in 5 minutes, forcing them to decide whether the past would remain private or follow them onto the stage. Jasmine asked him to make the announcement he had planned, but she warned him not to sign the property transfer attached to the expansion agreement until he understood what his company intended to destroy. Alexander stared at her, uncertain whether she was referring to the message about her letter or something larger, and she explained that one of the buildings targeted for redevelopment housed a community center serving foster youth and low-income families. Hayes Capital had classified the property as an underperforming commercial asset, yet hundreds of children considered it the only place in the city where adults remembered their names. Alexander insisted that no final purchase had reached his desk, but Jasmine quietly replied that his signature was already printed on the closing authorization waiting backstage. She had not returned to revive an old romance or expose a family secret during a public celebration. She had returned because the same system that separated them 15 years earlier was now preparing to displace children who had no power to challenge it. Then she placed a sealed envelope in his hand and told him that inside was the letter Margaret had prevented him from reading, along with proof that someone at Hayes Capital had been using his name to approve transactions he had never reviewed. The orchestra stopped, the lights shifted toward the stage, and hundreds of guests turned expectantly toward Alexander as an assistant approached carrying the ceremonial agreement. Margaret stood beside the podium, pale but composed, while Jasmine remained among the volunteers rather than the donors. Alexander looked down at the signature line bearing his name, then at the unopened envelope pressed beneath his hand, understanding that whatever he chose next would expose either his company, his family, or himself. He stepped toward the microphone, set aside the prepared speech, and announced that the foundation expansion would not move forward that evening. A murmur swept through the ballroom, followed by the clicking of cameras and the alarmed expressions of board members who had expected a celebration rather than a public delay. Alexander then said that charitable promises meant nothing if the business funding them caused harm no one had bothered to measure. Across the room, Jasmine held his gaze, but before he could reach her, Richard Bennett, Hayes Capital's senior vice president of real estate, moved toward the exit with the urgency of a man who had just realized the missing woman had brought more than a letter. Alexander left the stage before the applause had fully died, but Richard Bennett had already disappeared into the private elevator reserved for executives and security staff. Daniel instructed building personnel to preserve every access log and prevent the destruction of electronic records, while Margaret stood motionless beside the podium, watching Jasmine as though the years between them had never truly ended. The guests were guided toward dinner under the explanation that a legal review had delayed the announcement, yet whispers spread quickly through the ballroom, turning a philanthropic celebration into a room filled with speculation. Alexander found Jasmine near the terrace doors and asked whether Richard knew she was coming, but she admitted she had not contacted anyone at Hayes Capital except Sophia. The evidence had reached her through a former accounting analyst who disappeared from work 2 days earlier after discovering that community properties were being purchased through shell companies, then transferred to private developers at inflated values. Jasmine believed the analyst intended to meet her that evening, but instead sent the original envelope through an unknown intermediary and stopped answering his telephone. They moved into the library with Daniel and Sophia, locking the doors behind them while the event continued outside. Inside Jasmine's envelope were copies of acquisition reports, internal emails, and a handwritten letter dated 15 years earlier, its pages yellowed but unmistakably hers. Alexander recognized the first paragraph immediately because several sentences matched the farewell note he had preserved. yet the rest had been removed and replaced with language asking him not to search for her. The original letter explained that Margaret had visited Jasmine the evening before Alexander planned to propose, describing William Hayes's emergency heart surgery and the financial crisis threatening thousands of employees. Jasmine had written that she was leaving temporarily, not forever, because she feared Alexander would abandon the company during its most dangerous moment, if forced to choose between love and duty. She intended to contact him after the crisis passed, and she begged him to understand that distance was not rejection. Someone had rewritten the ending, shortened the letter, and ensured Alexander believed she had chosen a different life. Alexander looked toward his grandmother, who had entered the library without being invited, and asked whether she altered the letter. Margaret admitted taking it from Jasmine, but she denied rewriting anything, explaining that she had delivered the original to William because Alexander's father insisted he would decide when his son should receive it. William had been recovering from surgery while negotiating emergency refinancing, and he believed Alexander needed to remain focused until the company survived. Margaret thought the delay would last several weeks, yet the crisis deepened. William suffered complications, and shame gradually replaced the courage required to correct what they had done. Jasmine had moved after her mother became ill, and every attempt Margaret made to locate her reached outdated addresses. Alexander struggled to accept the explanation, because regret did not erase the choice, but the acquisition records in his hand demanded immediate attention. The same initials written beside the altered property approvals appeared in blue ink at the bottom of Jasmine's shortened farewell note. Daniel compared the handwriting with several archived corporate documents and identified the initials as belonging to Charles Wynn, the former Hayes family attorney who had managed both personal correspondence and emergency financing during the crisis. Charles had retired 5 years earlier, yet Richard Bennett had worked under him before joining the real estate division, creating a connection that none of them could ignore. Jasmine explained that the missing analyst, Marcus Reed, had discovered payments routed through consulting companies established by Charles and later controlled by Richard. The community center was not merely one threatened building. It was one of 12 nonprofit properties purchased through pressured sales, rezoning rumors, and deliberately withheld information. Richard's division profited by acquiring land before public transit expansions and luxury developments increased its value. The charitable foundation then donated small amounts to displaced organizations, allowing Hayes Capital to appear generous, while another part of the company benefited from their instability. Alexander felt the full weight of Jasmine's warning because he had personally approved annual reports praising the company's community impact, trusting summaries prepared by executives whose results appeared flawless. He asked why Marcus contacted Jasmine rather than Daniel or a federal investigator, and Sophia revealed that Marcus had once attended the community center as a teenager. Jasmine had helped him apply to college, found emergency housing when his foster placement collapsed, and convinced him that integrity mattered, even when powerful institutions rewarded silence. He trusted her because she had never treated him as a public success story or a charitable statistic. Jasmine had urged him to preserve evidence and speak through an attorney, but Marcus feared the company would identify him before he could secure protection. His final message contained one location, one time, and a warning that someone inside Hayes Capital knew he had copied the files. Daniel contacted a former federal prosecutor who specialized in corporate whistleblower cases, while Alexander ordered an immediate freeze on every real estate transaction approved by Richard's division. The board resisted through urgent telephone calls, warning that public intervention could trigger lawsuits, damage investor confidence, and expose the company to losses exceeding hundreds of millions of dollars. Alexander answered that financial damage could be repaired, but deliberate harm disguised as strategy could not be defended. Margaret listened silently, then admitted that Charles Wynn had once argued the same language of necessity when he persuaded the family to conceal Jasmine's letter. He believed individual pain became acceptable whenever enough jobs, money, or reputation appeared to depend upon it. Jasmine looked at Alexander and said the danger was not that powerful people lacked compassion. The danger was that institutions taught them to measure compassion only after profit had been protected. Marcus had arranged to meet Jasmine at the community center after the scholarship ceremony, so the four of them left the penthouse through a service entrance to avoid reporters gathering outside. During the drive, Alexander and Jasmine sat together in the rear seat without touching, their attention divided between the evidence, the missing analyst, and the truth neither had yet processed. Alexander apologized for benefiting from a decision that stole her voice, but Jasmine refused to let him accept responsibility for choices made without his knowledge. She admitted that after her mother died, she nearly contacted him many times, yet each year made the silence harder to cross, because she had built a life around believing sacrifice must have meaning. Neither of them called the past romantic, noble, or inevitable. It had been a failure of honesty shaped by fear, and acknowledging that truth felt more intimate than pretending love alone could repair it. The community center appeared dark when they arrived, although Marcus had specifically asked that the side entrance remain open. Jasmine noticed a classroom light flickering near the rear hallway and entered with Sophia while Daniel contacted the authorities. Alexander followed despite instructions to remain outside, unwilling to let Jasmine face another consequence of his company alone. They found no sign of forced entry, but several filing cabinets had been opened, computers removed, and the office safe left empty. On Jasmine's desk rested the handmade drawing a child had given Marcus years earlier, showing the center beneath a blue sky, except someone had written an address across the back. Daniel recognized it as a storage facility near the Chicago River, and beneath the address Marcus had added 5 words that transformed the investigation. The property deal is not Richard's. The storage facility stood beneath an elevated railway where passing trains shook dust from the metal beams and drowned conversation every few minutes. Daniel insisted they wait for law enforcement, but Jasmine recognized Marcus's habit of leaving clues inside ordinary memories, and she feared whoever searched the center might reach the unit first. The number written beneath the address matched the month and year Marcus entered foster care, leading them to a narrow locker secured with a keypad rather than a key. Jasmine entered the birthday of his younger sister, the only family member he had managed to remain connected with, and the lock released immediately. Inside were no stolen computers or bags of money, only a folding chair, a portable recorder, several banker's boxes, and a printed photograph of William Hayes standing beside Charles Wynne and Richard Bennett 15 years earlier. On the wall behind them hung a redevelopment map that marked many of the same neighborhoods now targeted by Hayes Capital. A recorded message began when Alexander pressed the power button, and Marcus's voice filled the cramped unit with the strained calm of someone expecting to be interrupted. He explained that Richard had approved the recent acquisitions, but the strategy originated years earlier through a private investment partnership created by Charles Wynne while William Hayes was recovering from surgery. The partnership used confidential knowledge from Hayes Capital's refinancing negotiations to purchase distressed properties near future infrastructure projects. William discovered irregularities and ordered Charles to dissolve the arrangement, yet Charles concealed several accounts and later recruited Richard to continue the model through legitimate corporate subsidiaries. Marcus had found evidence that profits from those transactions funded political donations, legal settlements, and payments to executives who protected the scheme. The community center was targeted because its property records contained an easement that could expose how earlier parcels had been transferred through falsified notices. Marcus said he copied everything after discovering Alexander's digital signature attached to approvals issued while Alexander was traveling outside the country. Richard's team used an automated authorization system intended for routine renewals, expanding its access without board permission and relying upon Alexander's reputation to prevent scrutiny. Marcus had planned to provide the records to federal investigators, but someone threatened his younger sister and sent photographs proving they knew where she worked. He moved her to a safe location, then created separate evidence packages so no single person could destroy the case. Jasmine's package exposed the property transactions, Daniel's would reveal the legal structure, and Alexander's could only be found if he understood which childhood promise his father failed to keep. The recording ended with Marcus apologizing for involving them, followed by a warning that Charles Wynne was not retired, despite appearing to live quietly in Arizona. Alexander searched the boxes while Daniel examined corporate ledgers, and Jasmine found a sealed folder labeled North Star, the private name she and Alexander once used for their college scholarship dream. Inside was a copy of William's handwritten journal entry describing his discovery of Charles's partnership, along with a promise to expose the scheme after the company recovered. William feared immediate disclosure would collapse the refinancing agreement and destroy thousands of jobs, so he chose delay, believing he could control Charles afterward. The journal revealed that Charles used Jasmine's departure to pressure William into silence, threatening to release private medical records, and claimed the Hayes family manipulated investors during the emergency. William signed a confidential settlement that removed Charles from daily operations but allowed him to preserve several outside interests. The decision saved the company temporarily, yet it also gave Charles years to rebuild influence through younger executives such as Richard. Jasmine realized the same fear had shaped every wrong decision surrounding them. Margaret feared Alexander would abandon the company. William feared disclosure would destroy employees. Jasmine feared her return would reopen wounds. And Alexander feared questioning successful executives would appear disloyal. None of them intended to create corruption, but each silence became a place where someone less principled could operate. Alexander did not excuse his father, although understanding the pressure made the betrayal more painful rather than less. He had spent years admiring William's steadiness, never realizing that some of the company's stability had been purchased through postponed truth. Daniel reminded him that the evidence still needed authentication because a journal and recorded statement could guide an investigation but would not establish every crime. They needed Marcus alive, the original digital logs, and proof connecting Charles directly to the current purchases. A train thundered overhead, and when the sound faded, Jasmine heard movement beyond the storage corridor. Alexander switched off the recorder while Daniel called the prosecutor, but the footsteps stopped before reaching their unit. A woman's voice identified herself as Marcus's sister, Elena Reed, and asked Jasmine to open the door. Elena entered carrying a laptop and a sealed evidence bag, explaining that Marcus was safe but injured after being forced off the road the previous evening. He refused hospital treatment under his own name because he believed corporate security contractors were monitoring local admissions. Elena had moved him into a church-operated shelter managed by people Jasmine trusted, and she came only after receiving confirmation that the acquisition freeze had been announced. Marcus believed Alexander's public decision at the gala proved he might choose truth over reputation, but he still feared the board would remove him before the evidence became public. Elena opened the laptop and showed them a secure archive containing approval records, internal messages, and audio from a meeting between Richard and Charles held 3 months earlier. Richard argued that purchasing the community center would draw unwanted attention because Jasmine's organization had strong public support. Charles dismissed the concern, saying Jasmine had spent 15 years protecting the Hayes family's image and would not suddenly become dangerous. He believed her silence could be used twice, first to keep Alexander focused during the refinancing crisis, then to keep the foundation from investigating the properties connected to her programs. Alexander listened without speaking, but anger changed the way he held himself. Jasmine placed a hand near his arm without touching and warned him that Charles depended upon emotional reactions because outrage created mistakes lawyers could later exploit. Daniel proposed transferring the archive directly to the prosecutor, yet Elena explained that Marcus had encrypted the most important file behind a voice authorization only Alexander could complete. The password prompt played a recording of William asking his son a question from childhood: "What do you owe the people whose names never appear in the report?" Alexander remembered his father asking it whenever they visited company facilities, teaching him to notice custodians, drivers, assistants, and factory workers, whose labor disappeared inside executive summaries. He answered, "The truth about what our decisions cost them," and the encrypted file opened. Inside was a video recorded by Charles only 48 hours earlier, apparently intended for Richard. Charles said the final purchase must close before Alexander's foundation announcement, because once the easement beneath the community center transferred, the remaining evidence of the original land scheme could be legally buried through redevelopment. He ended with a threat that made Margaret's concealed letter seem like only the beginning. If Alexander interferes, release the medical file and make the public believe his father built Hayes Capital through fraud. By sunrise, the investigation had moved into Daniel's downtown office, where the windows reflected a city beginning another ordinary workday, while Alexander's private world approached collapse. The former federal prosecutor, Rebecca Sloan, reviewed the archive with 2 forensic accountants and warned that several records appeared credible, although releasing them prematurely could allow Charles to claim manipulation. William's medical file posed little legal danger by itself, but documents suggesting Hayes Capital misled lenders during refinancing could trigger regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and immediate demands for Alexander's resignation. The board scheduled an emergency meeting for 9 o'clock, and several directors had already circulated a proposal granting Richard temporary authority until the allegations were resolved. Alexander understood that Charles did not need to prove William committed fraud. He only needed to create enough uncertainty for frightened investors to remove the person capable of stopping the property transfers. Jasmine asked what would happen to employees if the company's credit lines froze, forcing Alexander to confront the same argument that had controlled his family 15 years earlier. Rebecca explained that the strongest path required separating legitimate emergency decisions from Charles's hidden transactions, then demonstrating that Alexander acted immediately after learning the truth. Concealment would protect the share price for several days and destroy the company afterward, while transparent disclosure might cause immediate losses but preserve legal credibility. Daniel advised Alexander to enter the board meeting with a documented plan protecting employees, suspending implicated executives, funding independent counsel, and preserving community programs during the investigation. Margaret offered to provide a sworn statement describing Charles's influence over the family, including the altered correspondence and threats made during William's illness. She did not ask whether public testimony would damage her reputation, because regret had finally become less important than responsibility. Jasmine agreed to testify only about facts she personally witnessed, refusing to exaggerate her sacrifice or allow the case to become a sentimental story about lost love. Before the meeting, Alexander visited Marcus at the church shelter, where the young analyst rested beneath a borrowed blanket with bruises across one side of his face. Marcus apologized for using Jasmine and the foundation to reach him, but Alexander said the apology belonged to the company that taught an honest employee to fear reporting the truth. Marcus described how he first noticed duplicate consulting invoices attached to properties near the planned transit corridor, then discovered approval timestamps issued while senior executives were abroad. When he raised concerns internally, Richard praised his diligence and quietly transferred him away from acquisition files, confirming that the irregularities were deliberate. Marcus had copied the records because Jasmine once told him that courage was not the absence of fear, it was deciding which fear should be allowed to control the next action. Alexander promised him legal protection, continued salary, and a position after the investigation, but Marcus declined any guarantee that might appear to purchase his testimony. The boardroom contained 12 directors, 6 attorneys, and enough anxiety to make every polite greeting feel rehearsed. Richard attended through a video connection from New York, appearing calm, professionally offended, and fully prepared to portray Alexander's actions as an emotional response to Jasmine's return. He argued that the property purchases were lawful, commercially necessary, and approved through standard authorization systems created under Alexander's leadership. Several directors questioned why the company should jeopardize thousands of employees because one nonprofit lease generated negative publicity. Alexander answered that the issue was not one lease. It was whether Hayes Capital's decision-making system had been manipulated to hide conflicts, falsify approvals, and profit from communities the foundation claimed to support. He distributed the preliminary audit, disclosed the digital signature irregularities, and announced that Rebecca Sloan had been retained as independent counsel with authority to report directly to a board committee. Richard challenged the authenticity of Marcus's records and implied Jasmine had influenced Alexander for personal reasons after 15 years apart. The accusation created exactly the reaction Charles expected, but Alexander refused to defend his relationship or turn the meeting into a dispute about private history. He asked Richard one factual question: Why had the community center purchase been accelerated 3 weeks ahead of schedule, despite no competing bid appearing in the official file? Richard claimed a commercial developer submitted a cash offer, yet Daniel produced confirmation from the property owner's attorney that the competing offer arrived through a shell company sharing an address with Richard's personal investment advisor. Silence spread across the room as directors reviewed the documents. Richard's expression tightened, and he accused Alexander of sacrificing corporate discipline for public approval. The board voted to suspend Richard, freeze the real estate division, and authorize a wider forensic review, but the decision passed by only one vote. Before the meeting ended, Charles Wynn released selected refinancing documents to a financial journalist, framing William's medical crisis and private settlement as evidence of systematic deception. News alerts appeared across every screen within minutes. Hayes Capital's stock price dropped sharply, and reporters gathered outside the building demanding to know whether Alexander's father had hidden material information from investors. Employees began calling managers for reassurance, while lenders requested emergency discussions and nonprofit partners questioned whether promised funding would continue. Alexander felt the temptation to deny everything until the facts could be organized, because delay would stabilize the company long enough to breathe. Margaret recognized the conflict in his face and told him that fear always arrived wearing the language of responsibility. Jasmine stood beside the conference table, not as the woman he had lost, but as the leader of an organization facing consequences from decisions she did not create. She reminded him that truth without preparation could harm innocent people, yet preparation without a deadline could become another form of concealment. Together they created a plan separating employee protections from executive accountability. Payroll reserves would be secured, scholarship commitments transferred into an independent trust, community leases extended, and the company's lenders invited into a confidential evidence review. Alexander scheduled a public statement for that afternoon, promising full disclosure of what was known, what remained uncertain, and what actions had already begun. He refused to claim his father was innocent or guilty before the review, but he would acknowledge that the family's silence allowed misconduct to survive. As they prepared to leave for the press conference, Rebecca received a call from investigators who had located Charles at a private airfield outside Chicago. He had attempted to depart aboard a chartered aircraft, carrying encrypted drives, property deeds, and financial records connecting him to decades of transactions. Charles agreed to surrender only after learning that Richard had been suspended and the evidence archive had reached federal custody. Yet one item found inside his briefcase created a final uncertainty more personal than any corporate charge. It was a signed agreement showing that, 6 months after Jasmine disappeared, William transferred a substantial sum to a trust established in her name, although Jasmine swore she had never known the trust existed or received a single dollar from it. The trust agreement appeared to confirm the ugliest interpretation Charles could offer, that William Hayes paid Jasmine Carter to disappear and concealed the transaction behind charitable language. Reporters had not yet obtained the document, but Rebecca warned that investigators would eventually disclose its existence, making secrecy impossible and delay dangerous. Jasmine examined the signature pages without becoming defensive, then noticed that the beneficiary designation used her full legal name but listed an incorrect middle initial. The trust's mailing address belonged to an apartment she had left before Margaret ever visited her, and annual statements had been directed to a private mailbox controlled by Charles Wynn's law firm. Daniel discovered that the account had grown to several $1 million through investments, yet no withdrawals had ever been made. Charles had preserved the trust because its existence allowed him to threaten both sides, telling William that exposure would resemble bribery while ensuring Jasmine never knew money had been placed in her name. Margaret remembered William establishing an emergency fund after failing to locate Jasmine, believing she had sacrificed her future because of the family's request. He intended the money to support her education and community work without obligating her to return, but Charles insisted the arrangement remain confidential until contact could be reestablished. William trusted the same attorney already using private information against him, repeating the error that shaped every later consequence. Jasmine refused the idea that financial compensation could repair what was taken, Yet she also recognized the account might legally belong to her. Alexander offered no opinion about what she should do, understanding that even generous advice could become another attempt by the Hayes family to control her choices. She asked Rebecca to preserve the full value for the investigation, then requested that any lawful remainder be transferred into an independent endowment for foster youth, with governance shared by community representatives rather than Hayes Capital. The public statement took place in the Foundation auditorium, without dramatic staging, charitable banners, or executives positioned behind Alexander for reassurance. He explained that an internal review had identified unauthorized approvals, undisclosed conflicts, and potential misconduct involving current and former advisors. He acknowledged that decisions made during his father's illness were concealed from him and might have allowed later abuses, although the evidence had not established that William personally benefited from the transactions. Alexander announced protections for employees, independent management of scholarship funds, and temporary control of threatened properties by community trusts. He refused questions about Jasmine's private history, stating that she had provided evidence as a non-profit leader and deserved to be treated as a witness rather than a symbol in someone else's redemption. The stock price continued falling, but several lenders agreed to maintain credit after reviewing the evidence and employee protection plan. Charles's attorneys attempted to blame Richard, claiming the older man merely offered strategic advice after retirement, but the drives recovered at the airfield contained recordings, transaction instructions, and threats directed toward employees who questioned the acquisitions. Richard entered negotiations with investigators and admitted using Alexander's digital authorization, believing Charles possessed enough influence to protect him if irregularities were discovered. He also confirmed that Charles altered Jasmine's farewell letter years earlier, removing her promise to return because uncertainty gave him leverage over William. Charles understood that Alexander's grief made him more dependent upon the company, while William's guilt made him less likely to expose the attorney who controlled the correspondence. What began as an attempt to delay a young couple's reunion became a tool for protecting financial misconduct, proving that one private act of manipulation could expand when powerful people chose silence over correction. Alexander met Jasmine that evening at the community center, after reporters finally left the surrounding streets. Children had decorated the hallway with handwritten signs supporting Marcus, although Jasmine asked volunteers to remove anything portraying him as fearless or heroic. She wanted the students to understand that courage could include fear, uncertainty, and asking others for protection. Alexander helped repair a broken bookshelf, while Jasmine organized temporary lease agreements, and the ordinary work allowed them to speak without the pressure of family secrets or corporate decisions. He admitted that part of him still wanted to recover the years they lost, as though enough apologies or generosity could return them to the people they once were. Jasmine told him those younger versions deserved compassion, not resurrection, because neither had the knowledge required to challenge the adults controlling their choices. They discussed what a future might honestly contain, including distrust, public attention, different routines, and the possibility that love remembered was not identical to love rebuilt. Jasmine had created a full life through work, friendships, and responsibility, while Alexander had organized his identity around leadership and the discipline of never needing anyone too deeply. Neither wanted a reunion based on gratitude, guilt, or the emotional spectacle surrounding the investigation. They agreed to begin with something less romantic and more difficult. Truth told, before it became convenient, questions asked, before assumptions hardened, and time together without promises, designed to comfort the past. Alexander laughed when she ordered hot chocolate from the center's vending machine, despite its questionable quality, and the sound felt more hopeful than any declaration either could have made. Marcus returned to the center several days later after investigators placed his sister under formal protection. He received no applause arranged by administrators, only warm greetings from students who remembered him as the graduate who still helped with mathematics on Saturdays. Marcus explained that he had nearly deleted the files because exposing the company threatened jobs belonging to people who had never participated in the misconduct. Jasmine told him that responsibility did not require protecting a system from the consequences of its own choices. It required protecting innocent people while correcting the system. Alexander invited him to join the independent ethics office once the investigation ended, with authority reporting outside operational leadership. Marcus accepted only after community representatives were granted seats on the oversight board. Weeks later, the court froze properties connected to Charles's network and prevented the community center from being sold. The city approved a temporary lease extension, but the building still required major repairs and could not remain the program's permanent home. Alexander proposed purchasing the property through the new endowment, yet Jasmine rejected any arrangement dependent upon his personal generosity. Together, they designed a community ownership model, funded by the recovered trust, municipal grants, local donations, and a contribution from Hayes Capital subject to independent supervision. The solution lacked the simplicity of a billionaire writing one check, but it offered something more durable. The people served by the center would possess legal authority over its future. On the morning the ownership agreement was scheduled to close, Daniel discovered one final document inside William's journal that had been missed because 2 pages were sealed together. It was not another confession or hidden financial record, but a letter addressed jointly to Alexander and Jasmine, written during the final year of William's life. He acknowledged that he delayed the truth out of fear, then allowed shame to become an excuse for continued silence. He asked them not to forgive him simply because he was gone, because death did not transform cowardice into wisdom. His final request was that they judge every future decision by one question: does this choice give the people affected by it a voice before the cost becomes irreversible? Alexander read William's letter aloud in the community center's empty classroom, where morning light rested across small desks, scarred by years of homework, spilled paint, and children carving initials into the wood. Jasmine listened without interrupting, allowing the words to remain uncomfortable rather than softening them into a final blessing. William did not ask them to reunite, protect the Hayes name, or remember him kindly. He asked them to build structures that made private courage less necessary because ordinary people possessed public power. Alexander understood that his father's last lesson was not about preserving a legacy, but correcting one. Jasmine folded the letter and placed it inside the same box as the college postcards, joining dreams written before they understood power, with a warning written after power had revealed its cost. Then they walked downstairs to sign an ownership agreement that placed the building into a community trust governed by parents, former students, neighborhood leaders, and professional advisors. The closing ceremony remained deliberately small, without celebrities, political speeches, or a stage designed around Alexander's presence. Marcus signed as an alumni representative, Sophia signed on behalf of the programs, and 2 parents signed after reading every provision with independent counsel provided by the trust. Hayes Capital contributed renovation funding, but received no naming rights, development options, or promotional control. Jasmine insisted that the center retain its original name because children should not have to watch wealthy donors rename the places created by community labor. Alexander accepted the condition without negotiation, recognizing how often generosity became another method of ownership when gratitude was expected in return. When the final signature was completed, a young student asked whether the building now belonged to them, and Jasmine answered that it belonged to the community as long as the community continued protecting one another. Charles Wynne later pleaded guilty to conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction, and witness intimidation, after Richard's testimony and the recovered records established the full scheme. Richard received a reduced sentence for cooperation. While several executives were dismissed for ignoring warning signs they considered too inconvenient to investigate. No evidence showed that William personally profited from Charles's transactions, but the independent report concluded that his secrecy and private settlement allowed misconduct to continue. Alexander released the findings without removing passages critical of his father, despite advisors warning that public honesty would permanently complicate the Hayes family reputation. The company lost major clients, endured lawsuits, and spent years rebuilding governance. Yet employee protections prevented mass layoffs, and several investors returned after reforms proved genuine. Alexander stepped away from controlling the charitable foundation, placing it under independent leadership that included people from the neighborhoods affected by corporate decisions. Margaret testified publicly about the conversation that led Jasmine to leave, refusing attempts by attorneys to portray her as either a villain or a helpless victim of circumstance. She admitted that fear shaped her judgment, but fear did not remove responsibility from the person making the decision. Afterward, she asked Jasmine whether forgiveness was possible, and Jasmine answered that forgiveness could begin without pretending trust had already returned. They met occasionally at the community center, where Margaret volunteered quietly in the literacy program and learned to receive instructions from coordinators young enough to be her grandchildren. Her presence did not erase the past, yet consistency slowly replaced apology with evidence. Alexander watched their cautious relationship develop and understood that reconciliation was not a dramatic moment, but a pattern of behavior sustained after attention disappeared. His relationship with Jasmine developed with the same patience. They did not announce a reunion, move into the same home, or attempt to recreate the proposal that never happened. They shared coffee after meetings, attended neighborhood events without cameras, and argued honestly about money, power, responsibility, and whether Alexander sometimes tried to solve emotional discomfort through action. Jasmine challenged his habit of taking control when uncertainty frightened him, while Alexander encouraged her to recognize that self-sacrifice could become another form of avoidance when it prevented others from choosing beside her. Their disagreements did not threaten the relationship because neither used silence as protection. For the first time, love became less about enduring pain privately and more about allowing another person to witness uncertainty before a decision was made. 1 year after the gala, the renovated community center reopened, with expanded classrooms, counseling offices, a kitchen, and a legal clinic for young adults leaving foster care. The blue sky drawing that Marcus once used as a clue was framed near the entrance, not because it represented the building's appearance, but because of the sentence written across the top. "This is the place where people remember my name." Alexander arrived early carrying folding chairs, while Jasmine organized volunteers and refused 3 separate requests to pose for photographs. During the ceremony, Marcus spoke about the people who helped him before anyone considered him successful, reminding the audience that systems changed only when those affected were allowed to challenge them safely. Margaret sat among parents rather than donors, and Daniel stood near the back with the exhausted satisfaction of an attorney who had finally completed work that began 15 years too late. After the guests departed, Alexander found Jasmine in the old classroom where they had read William's letter. She was studying the college postcards displayed inside a glass case, including one they wrote together predicting where life would find them after 10 years. Their younger selves imagined a shared home, a scholarship program, and enough courage to remain honest when life became difficult. They had reached none of those hopes on time, yet the delay no longer felt like proof that the dreams had failed. Alexander told her he had spent years believing closure meant receiving an explanation strong enough to make the loss reasonable. Jasmine answered that some losses never became reasonable. They simply stopped controlling every choice that followed. He reached into his coat, and Jasmine immediately raised an eyebrow, warning him that a public proposal would violate nearly every conversation they had shared during the previous year. Alexander laughed and removed no ring, only the original farewell note he had kept for 15 years. Beside it, he placed the complete letter recovered from Charles's files, then asked whether she wanted to decide together what should happen to them. Jasmine considered burning both pages, but eventually chose to donate them to the center's historical archive with the names removed, allowing future students to study how private silence could create public consequences. They walked outside beneath the evening lights, leaving the letters behind rather than carrying them into another chapter. At the entrance, Alexander asked whether she would have dinner with him the following Friday, at the same coffee shop where they once planned impossible futures over inexpensive drinks. Jasmine smiled and said she would meet him there, provided he understood that she was not returning to the life they lost. Alexander answered that he no longer wanted the past restored, because the people they had become deserved something built with open eyes. She took his hand, not as a reward for his reforms or proof that pain had been worthwhile, but as a choice made freely after every hidden cost had finally been named. Behind them, children's voices echoed through the reopened center, filling rooms that no executive report would ever describe completely. Alexander understood that a good ending was not one in which every wound disappeared, every reputation recovered, or every year returned. A good ending was one in which truth arrived soon enough to change what people chose next, and love became strong enough to include the voices fear once tried to silence.